At 36,000 feet, silence became the loudest sound in the cabin. Passengers leaned against their seats, unaware that the sky outside had just shifted into a battlefield. Two fighter jets streaked past the windows, their contrails cutting across the horizon. The crew panicked, the captain's voice crackled, and then vanished from the intercom. And that's when a woman in row 14 reached for the radio, her voice carrying words no civilian should have known. You're watching the Storyscape, where ordinary lives hide extraordinary pasts. Before we dive in, tell us in the comments, where are you watching from tonight? The Airbus had been cruising steady for nearly 2 hours, its engines humming a monotonous lull that usually sent half the cabin into drowsy half-dreams. Flight 267 was just another routine transatlantic crossing, a sky bridge between Boston and Madrid. The air inside smelled faintly of coffee and recirculated air, the kind every frequent flyer had learned to ignore. Row 14 was in the middle of the cabin, close enough to hear the bustle of the galley, far enough to stay invisible. Most eyes passed over the auburn-haired woman sitting by the window. To the man beside her, she was simply another professional, dressed sharply in a navy blazer and plain white top, hair tied back in a neat ponytail. She looked like someone on her way to a conference, maybe a consultant or lawyer. Nothing about her suggested she was anything else. The first jolt came without warning. The entire fuselage rattled, a metallic shiver that sent silverware clinking against trays. Nervous laughter rippled through the rows. A child squealed. Someone muttered about turbulence. But those who had flown often enough felt it. This wasn't turbulence. It was too sharp, too sudden, like an external force brushing against the aircraft. The captain's voice flickered through the intercom, already distorted. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking. We're experiencing a..." Static. The words died mid-sentence. The speaker hissed, then fell silent. That silence was worse than the jolt. It spread across the cabin like smoke, filling lungs, tightening throats. People looked up from books and screens, trading glances as if to confirm, "Did you hear that too?" The woman in row 14 didn't frown, didn't gasp, didn't exchange nervous whispers with her seatmate. She simply leaned closer to the window. At first, it was nothing but sky, brilliant blue, endless and ordinary. But then came the glints. Two specks, distant but unmistakable, closing fast. Within moments, they weren't specks, but silhouettes, sleek, predatory, slicing through cloud banks with frightening precision. The sunlight caught their metallic bodies, silver edges gleaming like blades. The cabin noticed.
The jet fighters roared closer, stabilizing in formation. F-22 Raptors. Anyone who had watched a military broadcast would recognize the design. Their presence here, beside a civilian airliner, was not routine. The cabin dissolved into whispers. Why are they here? Is this some kind of escort? No, something's wrong. This isn't normal. The auburn-haired woman unbuckled her seatbelt with quiet precision. Click. The sound cut through the murmurs around her. She stood just enough to reach the side panel where the emergency equipment was stored. Her fingers wrapped around a handheld radio unit, something most passengers wouldn't even glance at, let alone know how to use. "Excuse me, man. Please sit down." A flight attendant rushed forward, her voice tight with barely contained panic. The woman didn't look at her, didn't argue. She lifted the radio like it belonged in her hand. Her thumb flicked a switch, her wrist steady, her face set into the calm of someone who had seen storms much worse than this. The businessman beside her stammered, What are you doing?" She pressed the radio to her lips. Her words came fast, clipped, with a rhythm that was too exact, too sharp to be guessed. Raptor 2, this is Echo Actual. Confirm IFF handshake. Authentication code Bravo 7 Delta. The attendant froze mid-step. The businessman's mouth dropped open. Conversations around her sputtered into silence. For a moment, nothing happened. The only sound was the hiss of pressurized air. Then, outside the window, both fighter jets dipped their wings in unison, once, then twice. It wasn't random. It wasn't a flyby. It was an answer. The woman lowered the radio, her eyes never leaving the sky. To the rest of the cabin, she was still an anonymous passenger. But to the Raptors outside, she had just revealed herself with words no civilian should ever know. Row 14 was no ordinary seat, and she was no ordinary traveler. Gasps spread through the cabin like a chain reaction. People who had barely noticed the woman in row 14 moments ago now stared at her as though she'd pulled a weapon from her bag. Phones lowered. Conversations stopped mid-sentence. All eyes locked on the blazer-wearing stranger who had just spoken into a military frequency. The flight attendant stood frozen in the narrow aisle. Her lips parted as if she wanted to demand the radio back, but her voice caught in her throat. Training manuals hadn't prepared her for this. No airline course had ever covered what to do if a passenger reveals themselves to be communicating with fighter jets. The businessman beside the woman stammered again, louder this time. "What the hell was that? Who are you?"
She didn't answer him. Her gaze stayed on the window, on the Raptors holding formation outside. For a moment, the jets kept their distance, but then one slid forward just enough for its nose cone to be visible through the glass. The pilot inside was just a silhouette behind tinted canopy glass, but he raised one gloved hand, giving a short, sharp gesture. It was a signal. Recognition. A nod between soldiers who had once shared the same code. The passengers around row 14 leaned away, as if proximity to her was suddenly dangerous. Some whispered theories. She's air marshal. No, air marshals don't talk like that. She's military, has to be. The woman finally lowered the radio and exhaled slowly. Then she spoke, not into the device, but to herself, a whisper too soft for most to hear. They found me faster than I thought. The businessman blinked. Found you? Found you for what? Before she could answer, the intercom cracked alive again. This time, it wasn't the captain. It was someone else, a voice smoother, colder, coming directly from the Raptors outside. The sound carried a metallic edge, like it had traveled through too many layers of encryption. Echo Actual. This is Guardian Command. Authentication acknowledged. State your status. Over. The entire cabin froze. The voice wasn't speaking to the captain. It wasn't speaking to the airline crew. It was speaking directly to her. She brought the radio up again. Her voice was calm, professional, stripped of all the politeness she had worn like a mask. Guardian, Echo Actual is dark. Civilian cover intact. Situation compromised by loss of cockpit communication. Advise. The businessman beside her blinked, as if hearing another language. He wasn't wrong. What she said didn't belong in civilian ears. The reply came instantly, sharp. Echo Actual, stand by. Maintain control of the civilian environment. We are executing contingency Omega 7. Repeat, Omega 7.
Passengers around her didn't understand the words, but they heard the tension in the voice. Some gasped, some clutched armrests, and then the worst sound of all filled the cabin. The cockpit door slamming open. Two crew members stumbled into the aisle. One was pale as chalk, his uniform damp with sweat. The other, first officer, was trying to steady him. The captain's down. He collapsed, unresponsive. A ripple of horror swept through the passengers. Panic flared, raw and unfiltered.
For the first time, she turned her head and looked him directly in the eye. Her expression wasn't panicked. It wasn't even worried. It was the look of someone calculating a decision, someone weighing whether to keep a secret or to let it burn in the open. "I hoped I'd never need to touch a radio again," she said quietly. "But if the captain's down, and those jets are really here for me," she trailed off, her eyes flicking back to the window where one of the Raptors edged closer, almost within arm's reach of the glass. "Then this plane is no longer a civilian flight. Whether they know it or not, everyone on board just crossed into classified airspace." The businessman's face went pale. Around them, passengers cried out, begging for answers. The attendants struggled to hold control. And outside the window, the Raptors held steady, like hawks circling prey. For the first time, the woman in row 14 showed a flicker of something dangerous in her eyes. Not fear, not hesitation. It was recognition. The aisle had become chaos. Flight attendants were no longer calm hosts in pressed uniforms. They were emergency responders scrambling to hold back the panic of 200 strangers trapped in a metal tube at 36,000 feet. The words "Captain down" echoed through the rows like a curse, repeated in whispers and shouts until it became its own drumbeat. Passengers demanded answers. Some stood, some shook the attendants by the arms, others sobbed into their hands. A teenager clutched his phone, recording through trembling fingers as though proof of this moment might keep him safe. In the middle of it all, the woman in row 14 stayed seated, hands steady on the radio. The businessman beside her tried to wave down an attendant. "Do something! She's not supposed to have that! She's not crew!" But no one came. They were too busy trying to keep order. The woman exhaled once, a slow, measured breath, and then stood. Not hurried, not frantic. She rose with the quiet gravity of someone stepping into a role they'd sworn they'd never play again. She walked the narrow aisle with precision, moving toward the open cockpit door where the first officer was kneeling beside the collapsed captain. His face was flushed, sweat dripping down his temple as he barked into the overhead mic, "Mayday, Mayday, this is Flight 267. Our captain is incapacitated." His words broke, not from the radio, but from the shock of noticing her standing in the doorway. The passengers craned their necks. For many, it was the first clear view of her, calm eyes, straight posture, no hesitation in her steps. She didn't look like a passenger anymore. The first officer blinked. "Ma'am, you can't be here. Please return to your seat." But she didn't. She crouched.
"He's alive, but he's out cold. You're flying solo. How long have you logged without a captain?" The officer frowned, caught off guard. 5 years, first officer. Why?" She nodded once. "Good. You'll keep her steady. I'll handle comms." Before he could protest, she leaned past him and grabbed the secondary radio unit. Her hand moved across dials with the confidence of someone who had lived in cockpits, not merely walked through them. The screen lit, and static hissed alive. She keyed the mic. "This is Echo Actual. Flight 267 is compromised. Captain down, system stable. Civilian passengers contained. Raptors confirm escort." The reply came almost instantly, the metallic edge of encrypted comms slicing through the air. "Copy Echo Actual. You are cleared under Omega 7. Maintain civilian cover until handoff. Confirm control of the cabin." The first officer gaped at her. What the hell is Omega 7? Who are you?" She looked at him, and for a flicker of a second,
The mask of the corporate traveler was gone. What remained was sharper, harder. Her voice carried the tone of command, low, firm, unshakable. You don't want that answer right now. What you want is to keep your hands on that yoke and follow my lead. You fly, I talk. Understood? He hesitated, then nodded. There was something in her eyes that brooked no argument. Behind them, a small crowd of passengers had gathered near the cockpit door, whispering fiercely. A middle-aged woman hissed, "She's military, I swear it. Look at how she talks." Another muttered, "Then why's she on this flight? Why's the Air Force on our plane?" The whisper spread like wildfire, but none dared step closer. They could feel it, the invisible weight of authority she carried. She pressed the mic again. "Guardian Command, what's the threat profile? Raptors wouldn't be on our wing unless there was more than a medical diversion." Static crackled, then the voice returned. "Echo Actual. Intel confirms hostile interference on your flight path. Civilian passengers remain uninformed. You are to maintain cover and await instructions. Raptors will hold formation. Do not deviate." Her jaw clenched. She lowered the mic, muttering under her breath. Hostile interference. They didn't say hijack, which means... The officer glanced at her nervously. Means what? Means it's not inside the plane. It's outside, and it's still coming. The word spread quickly. The businessman, pale and sweating, stumbled back toward row 14, whispering what he'd heard to anyone who'd listen. Passengers' eyes darted between the woman and the windows, where the Raptors sliced through the clouds like guardians and executioners both. The plane jolted again, this time longer, rougher, a shudder that rattled the overhead bins. Gasps and screams erupted, coffee spilled, a baby wailed. She pressed against the side panel, bracing herself, and shot a glance at the officer. "Stabilize her. Don't let the passengers see you lose it." He gripped the yoke tighter, knuckles.
And in that moment, with alarms faintly chirping in the cockpit, the woman in row 14 became something else entirely. Not a traveler, not a bystander, but a leader staring down the storm. The radio hissed again, a new voice this time, deep, accented, not from the Raptors, not from Guardian Command. Unfamiliar, unwelcome. "Unidentified civilian flight, reduce altitude immediately. You are entering restricted airspace. Comply or face enforcement." The cabin erupted into fresh chaos. Passengers screamed. The officers' eyes went wide. The Raptors outside tightened formation, their wings almost brushing the Airbus as if preparing for combat. The woman's face hardened. She grabbed the radio, her voice sharp as steel. "Negative. This is Echo Actual. You have no jurisdiction here. Identify yourself now." Static. Then the voice returned, colder, more hostile. "You do not belong here, and you know why." The line went dead. The officer turned to her, panic across his face. Who was that? Her eyes narrowed on the horizon. Not who, what. And if they're here, then every life on this plane is already on the edge of a war no one was supposed to see. The passengers behind them held their breath. The Raptors outside roared louder, their engines thundering in the thin air. Row 14 was no longer just a seat. It was the command post in a battle that had just found its way into civilian skies. The cabin had dissolved into two worlds, the frantic cries of ordinary passengers and the razor-sharp silence around row 14. People clung to their armrests, praying under their breath, while others barked accusations at the flight attendants. The thin line of civility inside a pressurized metal tube was fracturing fast. The Raptors still held tight formation, but their presence wasn't comforting anymore. The closer they drew, the more their wings looked like blades pressed to the throat of the civilian jet. Cameras clicked, phones filmed, and somewhere a child whimpered. To them, it looked like a hijack. To her, it looked like a war she'd hoped she'd never face again. The hostile voice still lingered in the air, its echo etched into every ear. You do not belong here, and you know why. Her jaw tightened. She'd heard accents like that before, transmitted across encrypted channels in the middle of hostile skies. The cadence was wrong for air traffic control. This wasn't government protocol. This was something else. Mercenaries, ghosts of the black market, forces that operated where maps had no borders. The first officer was pale, his hands locked on the yoke. He whispered to her out of the side of his mouth. What does it mean? They said you know why. Do you? She didn't look at him. Her eyes were fixed on the clouds outside, her voice steady and clipped. Yes. Passengers nearby heard the answer. The word spread like sparks leaping row to row. She knows. She knows what this is.
A man in row 17 shouted, "Who are you? Tell us. You're military, aren't you? What are you hiding from us?" His voice cracked into anger, born not from hatred but fear. She finally turned, meeting the eyes of dozens of strangers. Her voice was calm, low, measured, carrying just enough weight to steady them. "I am not your enemy, but the people out there, the ones speaking on open comms, they are not here for you. They are here for me." The words hit like an explosion. Whispers surged. Some passengers recoiling as if she had confessed to carrying a weapon. Others stared in awe, trying to reconcile the poised stranger with the ordinary traveler they'd ignored all flight. The businessman who had sat beside her whispered hoarsely, "Then you'd better tell them why we shouldn't throw you out the door right now." Her eyes locked on his, not with anger, but with a steel that left him breathless. "Because without me, this plane doesn't make it home." The intercom crackled again. Guardian command broke through, their tone clipped and urgent. "Echo Actual, be advised, hostile aircraft detected on intercept vector. Not transponding, not IFF compliant. Raptors are engaging. Keep your cabin calm at all costs." The plane lurched suddenly, banking left. Passengers screamed as drinks spilled, luggage shifted, oxygen masks swayed loose from their housings. Through the right side windows, everyone saw it, the dark silhouette of another jet sliding out from the clouds. Not sleek and polished like the Raptors, but rough, patched together, its paint stripped of insignia. A mercenary craft, unmarked, illegal. The Raptors peeled away in a flash of afterburners, moving to intercept. Their contrail slashed white scars across the sky. Gasps filled the cabin as people pressed to the windows, torn between terror and awe. Inside the cockpit, the first officer shouted into the mic, "Control, this is Flight 267. What are those planes? Repeat, what are those planes?" She cut him off, hand firm on the mic. "They won't tell you, because you don't have clearance. But I do." She switched frequencies with practiced speed. "Raptor Lead, this is Echo Actual. Hostiles confirmed. Keep them outside engagement range of the Airbus. Copy?" "Copy, Echo Actual. Stay steady. We'll keep the wolves at bay." The officer turned to her, eyes wide. "You're giving them orders." "Not orders," she said, her gaze like ice on the horizon. "Coordination." The hostile jet cut closer, its nose angling toward the civilian plane, too close for comfort. For a sickening instant, the cabin was filled with its shadow. People screamed, ducked, grabbed each other as though the thin aluminum skin of the Airbus would shatter.
And in that chaos, she remembered. Not the cabin, not the businessman beside her, not even the terrified faces watching from the rows. She remembered the desert, the sound of a different cockpit rattling around her, sandstorms battering the canopy, hostile fighters circling above. She remembered a voice like this one taunting over the radio, promising no survivors. And she remembered how she had answered then, with fire, with steel, with the knowledge that hesitation killed. Her eyes hardened. The past wasn't behind her. It was here, clawing its way back. The officer's voice cracked. "They're locking on to us." The lights flickered. Warning tones shrieked. Passengers wailed, pressing masks over their faces. And through it all, the woman in row 14 lifted the radio, her voice calm and commanding, as if speaking to ghosts she had once defeated. "You've made your mistake. You think this is a civilian flight. But I am here. And if you know my name, then you know exactly how this ends." The comms hissed with silence. Even the hostile pilot hesitated. The Raptors circled tighter, their engines screaming. The Airbus shuddered under the strain of the storm above the Atlantic. And 200 passengers waited, caught between the sky they thought they knew and the war that had just found them. The Airbus jolted violently, pitching to one side as the Raptors screamed overhead. Oxygen masks dangled uselessly, swaying like pendulums as passengers cried out in fear. Some clutched their children, others dug their nails into the seatbacks in front of them, desperate to anchor themselves to anything solid in the chaos of thin air. Through the windows, the shadow of the hostile jet loomed larger, its fuselage scarred and painted in the dull gray of mercenary machines, stripped of markings, stripped of mercy. It wasn't there to escort, it was there to hunt. Inside the cockpit, alarms pulsed red. The first officer's voice cracked as he fought to keep the yoke steady. "They're targeting us. I've got lock indicators. This isn't a drill." Passengers heard those words, and panic spread like wildfire. A man in row 22 stood, shouting, "We're under attack! They're going to shoot us down!" His scream ignited others, the cabin filled with a chaos of hands, voices, tears. But over it all, one voice cut sharp and commanding, as though it belonged to the steel frame of the plane itself. "Everyone down, heads low, belt tight, now." It wasn't the voice of a flight attendant. It wasn't the voice of the officer. It was hers. Row 14 no longer belonged to the world of passengers. It had become the command chair of the entire flight. And to the shock of the crew, people listened. They bent forward, grabbed their belts, pulled children under their arms. Fear made them hesitate, but authority made them obey. The quiet traveler they'd ignored all flight had just taken control of 200 lives.
The officer glanced sideways at her. His voice trembled. How do you know what to say? Who are you?" She keyed the mic again, her tone clipped, precise, professional. "Raptor lead, this is Echo Actual. Hostiles are probing lock. Divert them now before they force me to act." Static filled the cabin before a pilot's voice barked back. "Echo Actual, confirmed, engaging." The passengers gasped as outside the window one of the Raptors peeled upward, rolling into the clouds like a predator scenting blood. A second later, the distant flash of missiles streaked toward the unmarked jet. The Airbus shook again, this time not from turbulence, but from shock waves echoing across the sky. Passengers screamed, covering their ears as thunder rolled outside the fuselage. Someone shouted, "They're fighting for us!" Another whispered, "No, they're fighting for her." The businessman, pale and sweating, turned toward her with trembling hands. "Why are they calling you Echo Actual? Why do those pilots take orders from you?" Her eyes stayed locked on the horizon, jaw clenched. She didn't answer him. Not yet. But the past had ways of forcing itself forward. In the flashes of lightning like fire outside the cabin windows, her reflection appeared against the glass, hard, sharp, and cold. For years, she had buried it under civilian clothes, forged IDs, and quiet flights across oceans. But she couldn't bury the truth forever. She had once been more than a soldier. She had been command. The Raptors carved the sky, their trails twisting into spirals as they pressed the hostile jets further out. For a breath, relief filled the cabin. Passengers dared to raise their heads,
dared to believe it might be over. And then the voice returned, darker, colder. You can't hide forever, Echo. The cabin fell silent again. The voice wasn't on open-air traffic frequencies anymore. It had cut straight into the channel she was using, into her frequency. The kind of intrusion only someone who had fought her before would know how to make. The first officer froze. They know you. Whoever's out there, they're after you. She lowered the mic, just enough to keep her words between them. Her eyes darkened, her voice quiet, but heavy with iron. They shouldn't. Not unless someone betrayed the registry. The businessman swallowed, his voice a rasp. Registry? What registry? Her gaze flicked toward him for the briefest second. The one that lists names you're never supposed to say. Code names. Call signs. Echo Actual isn't just a phrase. It's a command designation. And it means they're not here for a plane of civilians. They're here for me. The words carried through the cabin. Murmurs surged again, some passengers recoiling as if sitting too close to her could invite fire. Others, wide-eyed, stared with the dawning realization that their survival hinged on this one woman, this stranger who'd stopped pretending she was ordinary.
Outside, another hostile jet broke from the clouds, circling close enough that passengers could see the scarring on its hull, the crude missile racks bristling under its wings. The Raptors engaged, engines shrieking as they dove. The sky itself had become a battlefield, painted in trails of white contrails and bursts of fire. The woman in row 14 didn't flinch. She spoke into the mic again, voice crisp. Guardian Command, be advised. Hostile force is larger than reported. They know my call sign. This isn't a random intercept. Someone leaked. The reply was grim. Echo Actual, maintain position. You are not cleared to re-engage. Repeat, not cleared to re-engage. Civilian cover is priority. Her lips curled in a humorless smile. Not cleared. They still think I can sit still. She set the mic down. The officer looked at her in disbelief. What are you saying? She didn't answer him directly. Instead, she looked out at the Raptors carving fire into the sky, then down the aisle at the passengers, huddled in fear. Her voice, when it came, was almost a whisper, but sharp enough to cut through the noise of chaos. If they want Echo Actual back, they're about to get her. The officer stared at her like he was seeing her for the first time. And in truth, so was everyone else. The mask of anonymity was gone. In its place was a commander rising again in the most unlikely of places, row 14 of a civilian flight. And for the first time, the enemy outside wasn't the only one who felt the shift. Every passenger did too. They weren't just flying on Flight 267 anymore. They were flying inside her war. The sky was no longer blue. It was a battlefield painted in smoke and contrails, a place where two worlds collided, civilians clutching seatbelts in fear, and predators circling above with missiles primed. Inside the cabin, the air was thick with panic. Prayers whispered in dozens of languages. A baby wailed. Someone shouted, "We're going down!" The first officer's hands trembled on the yoke, fighting to keep the Airbus level as the plane shook under the shock waves of jet combat outside. And then another voice pierced the comms, the same hostile tone, dripping with menace. "You can't save them, Echo. Not this time. You'll choose your life or theirs." The passengers only heard static, but she heard every word. It wasn't a random threat, it was personal. Her reflection in the cockpit glass looked like a stranger now, not the corporate traveler who boarded in Boston, not the quiet woman in row 14. It was the face she had buried years ago, the one the world had once called Echo Actual. The Raptors outside tightened formation. One hostile jet lunged closer, missile bay doors yawning open. Screams tore through the cabin as passengers ducked, bracing for fire. She didn't flinch. She keyed in a command sequence so quickly the officer blinked in disbelief. "You still have access codes?" he stammered. Her reply was calm, final. "I never lost them." Outside, the Raptors broke into a deadly spiral. One of them dove under the Airbus, flaring countermeasures, streaking light across the sky like burning stars. The hostile missile veered, chasing the decoys into nothingness. A roar of relief spread through the cabin, but it wasn't over. The second hostile jet angled in, its weapons locked not on the Raptors, but directly on the Airbus. "Brace!" the officer shouted. Passengers cried out, some clutching strangers, some praying louder. The moment stretched thin, the horizon trembling with fire. And then the woman in row 14 lifted the radio again. Her voice rang out, sharp as a blade, heavy with authority. "Raptor lead, execute Black Vulture." There was a pause, just a heartbeat. Then the pilot's reply came back without hesitation. "Copy, Echo Actual. Black Vulture engaged." Outside, the sky erupted. The Raptors dove as one, their engines screaming. They rolled in unison, unleashing everything at once, missiles streaking, machine guns roaring, thunder splitting the thin air. The hostile jet never had a chance. It shattered into fire and smoke, spiraling down toward the ocean far below. The passengers saw it through the windows. Some screamed in shock. Others cheered in disbelief, clapping through tears. Relief poured through the cabin like oxygen. They were alive. The Raptors steadied, pulling back into escort positions. Silence fell inside the Airbus, broken only by sobs of exhaustion and gasps of breath. The first officer stared at her. His voice was hoarse, reverent. "Who are you?" She looked at him, then at the passengers still trembling in their seats. For a long moment she said nothing. Then softly, almost like a confession, "Someone who thought she'd left this life behind." She set the radio down, hands steady, eyes cold with memory. The mask of anonymity was gone forever. Echo Actual had returned. As the Raptors held formation and the Airbus leveled out, 200 passengers sat in stunned silence, knowing their lives had been saved by someone they would never truly understand. And somewhere, far below in the endless Atlantic, smoke still marked the place where their enemy had fallen. Proof that the quiet woman in row 14 was never just a passenger.